Imagine for a moment that you are a German soldier on the Eastern Front in 1942. It is the dead of winter. The temperature has plummeted to 30 degrees below zero. You are huddled in a trench, exhausted, trying to steal a few minutes of sleep before the next Soviet assault. The night is silent. Suddenly you hear a sound. It isn't the roar of a heavy engine or the scream of a dive bomber. It's a soft, rhythmic swooshing noise. It sounds almost like a sewing machine, or perhaps a broom sweeping across the floor. By the time you realize what it is, it's already too late. A small explosion rocks the earth near your bunker. Then another, and another. You run to your anti-aircraft gun, scanning the black sky, but there is nothing to see. The plane is too small, too low, and too slow to track. The noise fades away, leaving you awake, freezing, and terrified. You have just been visited by the Nachthexen, the night witches. This is the story of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, a group of aviators unlike any other in the history of warfare. They were not hardened veterans when they began. They were students, factory workers, and teenagers. They were women who demanded the right to fight for their country, and in doing so, they became legends. To understand how this regiment came to be, we have to look at the desperate situation the Soviet Union faced in 1941. Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion, was tearing through the country. The Red Army was suffering catastrophic losses. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies. The situation was dire. In Moscow, a famous aviatrix named Marina Raskova watched the destruction. Raskova was already a celebrity in the Soviet Union, known as the Soviet Amelia Earhart. She began receiving thousands of letters from women across the country who wanted to join the war effort, not as nurses or secretaries, but as combatants. They wanted to fly. Raskova used her influence to petition Joseph Stalin directly. She argued that Soviet women had already proven themselves in industry and agriculture. Why should they be barred from combat? Desperate for every able-bodied soldier, Stalin agreed. On October 8, 1941, 3 all-female air regiments were formed. There was a fighter regiment, a dive bomber regiment, and the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. While the other 2 regiments eventually became mixed with male personnel, the 588th remained exclusively female throughout the entire war. From the pilots and navigators to the mechanics and armorers, every single person in the unit was a woman. Most of them were between the ages of 17 and 26. They arrived at training camp expecting to be treated like soldiers. Instead, they were given men's uniforms that were far too large. They had to stuff their boots with rags to make them fit. They were given haircuts that were practically shaved heads. But the biggest shock came when they were introduced to their aircraft. The Polikarpov Po. It was a biplane designed in the 1920s. It was made of plywood and canvas. It had an open cockpit, leaving the pilots exposed to the freezing elements. It had a top speed of only 90 miles per hour, slower than most cars on a modern highway. It was originally designed as a crop duster and a trainer. To the young women hoping to fly modern fighters like the Yaks or MiGs, the Po-2 seemed like a cruel joke. But the Po-2 had hidden strengths. Because it was so slow, it could fly at treetop level, making it incredibly difficult for fast German fighters to shoot down. If a German Messerschmitt tried to slow down enough to get a bead on a Po-2, the German plane would stall and crash. The biplane was also incredibly maneuverable. It could turn on a dime. However, the drawbacks were severe. The canvas skin offered zero protection. A single tracer bullet could ignite the plane like a matchstick. There was no radio communication. The pilots had to signal each other by dipping their wings. Their navigation tools consisted of a map, a compass, and a stopwatch. And perhaps most terrifying of all, to save weight for bombs, the women were not issued parachutes. If the plane caught fire, they had 2 choices: burn with the machine or jump to their death. The regiment deployed to the front in 1942. Their mission was harassment bombing. The goal wasn't just to destroy targets, but to destroy the enemy's sleep. The tactics they developed were ingenious and incredibly dangerous. They flew only at night. Because the planes could only carry 2 bombs at a time, one under each wing, they had to fly multiple missions in a single night. Some pilots recorded flying as many as 18 missions between sunset and sunrise. They would fly in formations of 3. 2 planes would go in first to draw the enemy searchlights. As the German lights scanned the sky and the anti-aircraft guns opened fire, the 2 planes would peel off in opposite directions, acting as decoys. While the Germans were distracted, the 3rd plane would approach the target. The pilot would cut the engine. The plane would glide silently through the darkness. The only sound was the wind rushing over the canvas wires, that sweeping sound that the Germans came to dread. They would drop their payload with pinpoint accuracy, restart the engine, and scramble away before the shock wore off. The physical toll on the women was immense. The open cockpits meant they were constantly battling frostbite. In the winter, touching the metal of the plane with a bare hand would rip the skin off. They flew in snowstorms and gale-force winds. On the ground, the mechanics worked in equally brutal conditions. Without heavy machinery, the women had to lift the 100-kilogram bombs by hand, cranking them up under the wings. During a busy night, a ground crew might lift 3 tons of ordnance, all while working in the freezing mud with barely any food. Despite the exhaustion, the women of the 588th were relentless. One of the most famous pilots, Nadezhda Popova, recounted a night where she returned to base, her plane riddled with bullet holes, her map burnt, and her helmet grazed by a tracer. She simply drank a cup of tea, had the mechanics patch the holes, and went back up. The Germans were baffled. They couldn't understand how these primitive biplanes were causing so much damage and chaos. Rumors began to spread among the German ranks. They claimed the Soviet pilots were given special pills to see in the dark. They called them the Nachthexen, night witches. The nickname was meant to be derogatory, but the women of the 588th wore it as a badge of honor. The psychological impact was profound. The German soldiers couldn't sleep. They couldn't light fires for warmth. They lived in constant fear of the silent glide. It is said that the Luftwaffe was so embarrassed by their inability to stop the night witches that any German pilot who managed to shoot one down was automatically awarded the Iron Cross. But the war took a heavy toll. The regiment lost 32 pilots and navigators. One of the most tragic nights occurred when the Germans brought in specialized night fighters equipped with radar. In a single night, 4 planes were shot down, burning to ash as their comrades watched helpless. Yet they kept flying. They participated in the battle for the Caucasus, the liberation of Crimea, and the push into Poland. By the end of the war, they had flown all the way to Berlin. In total, the regiment flew over 23,000 sorties. They dropped over 3,000 tons of bombs and 26,000 incendiary shells. 23 of the regiment's members were awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest distinction. When the war finally ended, the Night Witches had flown deeper into enemy territory than almost any other unit. But their battle wasn't entirely over. Despite their heroism, they were not included in the massive Victory Day parade in Moscow. Some sources say it was because their planes were too slow to keep up with the formation. Others suggest it was because the rickety biplanes didn't project the image of modern military might the Soviet Union wanted to show the world. After the war, the regiment was disbanded. The women returned to civilian life. They went back to being students, teachers, and mothers. For a long time, their story was known only to historians and the men who had served alongside them. But the legacy of the Night Witches endures. They proved that courage is not about the equipment you carry, but the spirit you possess. They took a plane made of wood and canvas, a machine that should have been obsolete, and turned it into a weapon of terror against the most advanced military force of the time. They flew without parachutes. They flew through walls of fire. They flew until they were too exhausted to stand. And they did it all while breaking the barriers of what society thought women were capable of. So the next time you hear the wind whistling through the trees on a dark night, remember the sound of the canvas wings. Remember the young women who ruled the darkness. Remember the night witches,